Hello and welcome. 2D Gamer back again with an underrated gem review for Grand Prix Challenge on the Sony PlayStation 2. Unlike most of my underrated gems videos where I let the gameplay speak for itself, I decided that with over a decade of rust playing simulation racing games, I would do Grand Prix Challenge more justice in a review format. However, before I get into Grand Prix Challenge, I've decided to go over a little bit of gaming history with all of you. When the PS2 specs were first announced, the hype over the reported capabilities of Sony's new system was off the charts. Capabilities like the ability to push 60 million flat shaded polygons a second, without effects. A number that really meant nothing unless developers were going to make games without other things that tax the system, like textures, lighting, physics, and etc. However, this reality didn't come into the hype machine. I even remember George Lucas being quoted as saying that 60 million polygons a second would be up to the visual standards of the pod racing scenes in The Phantom Menace. On September 13th, 1999, just 4 days after the Dreamcast's North American launch, Sony unveiled the final design of the PlayStation 2 at that year's Tokyo Game Show, in a move to steal some of the Dreamcast's thunder in the eyes of gamers. Previously, all gamers had to go on were still frames of tech demos and early screens of games in development from the mainstream magazines at the time. If there was one group of gamers who were not all impressed with the PS2's early graphical showings or technical specs, aside from PC gamers who were never impressed with console anything, it was Dreamcast fans. After all the hype of the system's capabilities and the lackluster graphical showings in the PS2 launch titles, Dreamcast fans asked one simple question. Why do PS2 launch titles look worse than Dreamcast games? As PS2 ports of Dreamcast games came onto the scene, reportedly being inferior to their Dreamcast counterparts both graphically and not running as well, or even Dreamcast games that look better than their PS2 counterparts altogether, the fanboy flame wars heated up on gaming forums everywhere, with Dreamcast fans claiming that Sega's console had superior graphics to the PS2. While the debate covered and still covers a large variety of games, one debate still sticks into my mind even to this day. With first-generation PS2 racing games like Ridge Racer 5 and Driving Emotion Type S suffering heavily from first-generation PS2 visual glitches, like the dreaded jaggies and shimmering, or in the case of Driving Emotion, also suffering from terrible handling. I mean, seriously, I am not trying to go off the road in this gameplay! Dreamcast fans were quick to note that not only did these games not look better than Dreamcast racers, but neither of them was even close to Test Drive Le Mans. Even the later PS2 port of Le Mans 24 Hours, which I do not own as of yet, would be reportedly inferior graphically to the Dreamcast version. Finally, Sony released the hugely anticipated Gran Turismo 3 in the summer of 2001 in North America. The debate was over. No one could argue that GT3 looked leaps and bounds better than anything on the Dreamcast. Dreamcast fanboys would finally have to concede the PS2's victory. Right? Well, not exactly. Dreamcast fans fired back with one last retort. While Gran Turismo 3 did indeed look better than even Test Drive Le Mans, their counter was to point out that Le Mans looked almost as good as GT3, but had a maximum of 24 cars on the screen, compared to Gran Turismo 3's mere 8 cars. And with the PS2 port of Le Mans reportedly not being as good, this was still touted as proof that the Dreamcast was more powerful than the PS2. So what, you may ask, does this ancient relic of fanboy flame wars of the past have to do with Grand Prix Challenge? Melbourne House, the team behind Test Drive Le Mans and the Dreamcast, also developed Grand Prix Challenge on the PS2. And in many ways, I would consider it an F1 sequel to Test Drive Le Mans. I do not remember which YouTuber suggested Grand Prix Challenge to me, but I do remember that it came highly recommended. I put it on my list of games to get, But oddly enough, someone I know gave me 5 of their leftover PS2 games, and right there in the middle of the stack was Grand Prix Challenge. After booting it up, I quickly found out why it came so highly recommended. Grand Prix Challenge is an officially licensed F1 game, which covers the 2002 racing season. It lets players tear up the tracks with official F1 teams on official F1 courses. Players are given the option to tear it up in Quick Race, which throws players into a race but in last position. Grand Prix, which is also a single race event but allows for qualifying and tuning options. Championship, which takes players through all 17 race venues to complete the season. Grand Prix Challenge, which puts players in 10 race challenges with each challenge upping the difficulty as it goes on, taking away things like the ability to turn the AI opponents on easy or beginner and medium handling settings, meaning that by the last challenge, the player is racing in full sim mode with full rules, damage on, hard AI, and on their own racing skill without any handling help. Time trial, where players can race against the clock or a ghost car to complete the fastest lap, and multiplayer, which allows 2 friends to go head-to-head in Grand Prix. While my experience with F1 games is extremely limited, meaning I am unable to comment on how it stacks up to other F1 racers on the PS2, I can say that the gameplay in Grand Prix Challenge is incredibly satisfying in its own right, and the controls feel spot on, so long as you are using the D-pad to steer like I do, as the analog controls take some getting used to with the threat of overcorrecting. This is also the kind of game that racing steering wheel controllers were made for. But again, I cannot comment on how the controls feel with the racing steering wheel controller because I do not have one on the PS2. Those new to simulation racing games, or those who suck at them like I do, will find Grand Prix Challenge to be the perfect beginning simulation racer. One of the race options is the ability to set the handling on beginner, which means that like in Test Drive Le Mans, the game will actually brake for you on all the tight turns, meaning all you have to worry about is making the turn. This is what I call the training wheels mode, which will help newbies and those with lesser sim racing skills to still be able to play and enjoy the game. The only downside to the beginner handling setting is that it can be used as a crutch to keep you from trying to improve your skills. However, the Grand Prix Challenge mode is the perfect mode to help new players learn the skills necessary to compete on their own without the beginning handling, bringing about the thrill of true simulation driving done in your own skill. Graphically speaking, by PS2 standards, for a game developed in 2002, not only does the game look really good, with cool touches like smoke effects and tires that pick up sand and grass should you go off the road, not that I would know, but the game moves at a constant 60 frames per second. Even with 21 cars ahead of you in the middle of a rainstorm with particle effects galore, like raindrops on the screen as you play, the game doesn't slow down. I was, however, unable to test slowdown in the multiplayer mode as of making this video. This game looks great for a PS2 game and has an immaculate frame rate to boot. If there are any downsides to Grand Prix Challenge, it would have to be the shorter play length when compared to the overwhelming amount of racing modes in games like Gran Turismo. There are a few things to unlock like all the tracks and even a harder AI difficulty, but overall, Grand Prix Challenge will not keep you as long as other racing sims. The tuning options are also pretty bare bones. This isn't the game to build a car from the ground up in. Also, Gran Turismo and Test Drive Le Mans fans will not find the coveted 24-hour endurance races here. You can set the lap options to the full F1 race lengths for the true sim feel, but as an F1 game, Grand Prix does not have the hardcore appeal of the full 24-hour race. Which, if you ask me, no big loss there. The bottom line. This is one for racing purists. Those who love the thrill of simulation racing should definitely look into Grand Prix Challenge. Those who are new or have a lower skill are also welcome to enjoy this truly underrated game. So, now that I have informed you of the great fanboy graphics debate of the PS2 versus the Dreamcast, what happens and who wins when we compare Grand Prix Challenge to Test Drive Le Mans on the Sega Dreamcast? The answer is simple. The person playing both games to do the comparison wins, because they're both great and you should look into both of them. Test Drive Le Mans was also released on the PC, the PS2, the PS1, and even the Game Boy Advance. Check into Test Drive Le Mans if you have never played it, and check into Grand Prix because it's an underrated game.